Welcome. I'm Michael Rugel from the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. It's a pleasure to be here today with Stephen Collis, author of The Immortals, a World War II story of five fearless heroes, the sinking of the Dorchester, and an awe-inspiring rescue. I want to mention one program we got coming up next week at this same time. We'll be with Ira Kidmacher, who is the author of a book called Monsters and Miracles, Horrors, Heroes, and the Holocaust. It's a really interesting book that looks at his father, a Holocaust survivor, and his mother, a Navy wave, and it kind of puts it in the context of traditional Jewish folklore in a very interesting way. Today's program is presented as part of our Alan S. Brown Scholar Series. Alan S. Brown proudly served his country for 23 years as a U.S. naval officer and was a decorated veteran of the Vietnam War. In memory of his dedication to community and education, we present talks from renowned scholars and authors working in the field of American Jewish military history. Today's program is a interfaith story rather than a purely Jewish one. And in fact, the story of the four chaplains has become one of the most famous symbols of interfaith cooperation and personal sacrifice for others that may have different backgrounds or beliefs. And it really exemplifies the spirit of the military chaplaincy, where it's the job of religious officials to provide for the needs of all, no matter what their religion. And looking at this from the perspective of Jewish service members, there are countless examples of wonderful experiences of Jewish service members working with non-Jewish chaplains, and that might be just in terms of providing emotional support, or maybe the Protestant chaplain steps in to lead a Passover Seder, things like that. And that goes back at least to World War I. And of course, there are some times when the chaplains don't live up to that interfaith ideal, but I think those are the exceptions, and the military chaplaincy is really pretty remarkable institution in terms of that interfaith responsibility. And of course, the four chaplains does have an important Jewish component in the role of Rabbi Alexander Goode. Goode's always been an important figure to us here at the museum. His portrait hangs in the office space here in the building. And it's easy to feel a connection to Rabbi Goode, as he was a DC guy who spent his formative years not too far from where I'm sitting right now. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about Rabbi Goode. In addition to the chaplains' lives and actions, the book, The Immortals, does a great service by bringing some additional attention to Charles David Jr. and his heroic actions at the sinking of the Dorchester. So we'll hear more about that shortly. I will ask everyone who has questions. I already see there's already a couple popping up, but use the Q&A button at the bottom to submit questions. The chat is also open, but if you want your question responded to, please use the Q&A, and we'll have some time at the end to get the questions, but we'll also try to incorporate answers to questions in the Q&A throughout. Stephen T. Collis is the author of the nonfiction books The Immortals and Deep Conviction, and the novels Praying with the Enemy and At Any Cost. He is a law professor at the University of Texas Austin School of Law and founding faculty director of UT's First Amendment Center and Law and Religion Clinic. Prior to his appointment at UT, he was the Olin Darling Research Fellow in the Constitutional Law Center at Stanford Law School and an equity partner at Holland and Hart LLP, where he was the chair of the firm's nationwide religious institutions and First Amendment practice groups. He's a sought-after speaker on both writing and religion law to audiences across the United States, including foreign diplomats from countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and South America on behalf of the United States State Department. Welcome, Stephen. Thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Mike. This is great. I really appreciate you hosting this.
Yeah, maybe you can start out by just telling us a little bit about the book and the story of the four chaplains.
Yes, happy to do it. Let me start again by thanking you and thanking everyone who's listening. I'm grateful for the opportunity to do this. This year is the 80th anniversary of the story of the actual events related to the four chaplains and Charles David Jr. So it's appropriate to be able to do this, and I'm thankful for the museum for hosting me. I'm going to go through a bit of a monologue here where I give people the story and share a little video, the book trailer for the book. So I really would echo what you say, which is encouraging people to ask questions. If they pop into your mind, throw them into the Q&A, and we're happy to address them as best we can as we go forward. I also I have a special story related to Rabbi Goode that I think will be wonderful for your audience, Mike. I got an email from a reader of the book just out of the blue who has a family connection to Rabbi Goode that I had never heard before, and I don't think would have been recorded anywhere had she not read the book and then sent it to me. So I'll please don't let me forget to share that with your audience. I think it'll be especially special for them. Let me go ahead and share my screen if I could. I'll show the book trailer, which gives a quick summary, and then if it's all right, I'll just run through some slides, kind of breaking down the story, and then you and I can talk about whatever questions you'd like to ask. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
Great. Is that showing up okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Great. I'm gonna play this video, which is the book trailer for the book. And if you can't hear anything, you're the only person who can warn me, Mike. So let me know.
Will do.
In 1943, a Nazi U-boat in the North Atlantic Sea hunted the SS Dorchester with more than 900 soldiers on board. Surviving a torpedo attack in these frigid waters in winter would require a miracle and the sacrifice of the men who became known as the Immortal Chaplains. Their celebrated true account is now joined for the first time in print by the largely untold story of another hero, Charles Walter David Jr., a young Black petty officer aboard the Coast Guard cutter traveling with the Dorchester. Charles bravely dived into the glacial water over and over again, even with hypothermia setting in, to try and rescue the men the chaplains had inspired to never give up. Page-turning and inspiring, The Immortals is the World War II story told in an engrossing nonfiction narrative of 5 fearless heroes, the sinking of the Dorchester, and an awe-inspiring rescue.
So there's the trailer for the book, and it gives you a very quick overview of it. Now let me flesh out more of the history and put some flesh on those bones. So where I start in the book is actually at the moment that Adolf Hitler declares war against the United States. And if you go back and you look at the theme of his talk, his speech, what he talks about is how Germany united under Nazi rule cannot be defeated, and especially cannot be defeated by a fractured United States. And this wasn't just public rhetoric. Hitler really believed this. In some journals I found, they actually would sit around in the evening. He would sit around in the evening and just kind of pontificate on things. And they had a lawyer whose job was to sit there and take notes on everything he said. And he would reiterate these themes, that Germany had never been more united than it was under his rule, and that the United States is fractured racially and religiously, and a country that is fractured racially and religiously simply couldn't stand up to a united Germany. And he hit on that again and again and again. Here's what's interesting. Hitler was obviously insane and wrong about a lot of stuff, but one thing he was not wrong about was the idea of the United States being fractured. We've always had our ideals, and then we've always been chasing our ideals. And there's no question that in the late 1930s, early 1940s, the United States was a fractured country. In my field, the field of law and religion, we talk about something called the Puritan mistake, which it's this idea that we say the Puritans came here for religious freedom, and it's true, they did, but they were interested in freedom only for themselves, not for anybody else. They actually even passed a law saying, you can be a Puritan in Massachusetts or you can get out. So we refer to that as the Puritan mistake, and it's a mistake that we often make, and that we saw really prevalent in the United States, still prevalent today, of course, but even more prevalent in the 1930s and 40s, where religious groups did not get along. They were interested in protecting themselves and no one else under the law. And obviously we had a huge racial divide, far greater than we have today, with explicit racism all over the place. And so it was in that environment that the United States was then trying to take on the threat from the Nazis in Italy and Japan. And so query whether or not there wasn't a real risk of Hitler being proven right. You had in the military itself, you had overt racism, which matters much to this particular story because of the story of Charles W. David Jr. At the time, to the extent he was allowed to serve at all, he was basically only allowed to rise up to being a cook. He couldn't rise up in the ranks any more than that. And so you had a system that very explicitly prevented Black men and women, but at the time, so it was mostly men serving, it was Black men from advancing to any degree. So he joined the Coast Guard to help provide for his family. but he couldn't be anything other than a cook on this Coast Guard cutter that he was serving on. That matters later in the story of what he ended up doing. And then, of course, you have a lot of chaplains died and continue to die in the war in war and in World War I and World War II in particular. Lots of chaplains died. What made the story of the immortal chaplains so powerful, and what drove it home, I think, historically and even today, is that each of these chaplains was of a different religion. So you had George Fox, who was a Methodist minister, John Washington, who was a Catholic priest, Alexander Goode, who was a rabbi, and then Clark Poling, who was a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. Each of a different religion being asked to join forces to minister to all sorts of men, 900 men aboard a ship, who all had different religions, some of whom had no religion. And their job was to figure out a way to overcome the communities. The communities they were a part of did not get along well in the United States, these various religious communities. And all of them tended to have the tendency to commit the Puritan mistake. And so you had to find chaplains who could work well with each other despite their religious differences. And the goal of the chaplaincy, and especially of these four men, was how could they have unity without sacrificing their religious identities? How could they work for a common purpose but not give up any of their core ideas and beliefs about who they were? And they worked very hard to try to achieve that. The four chaplains were on a ship called the SS Dorchester. I'll have a picture of that in a minute. They were there. Their job was to provide chaplaincy services to the 900 men on board the ship that was going to go from New York to Greenland, across the Atlantic, where Nazi U-boats were attacking constantly. And then you had, along with the ship, Coast Guard cutters whose job was to protect the transport from Nazi attacks. And on one of those cutters was this man, Charles W. David Jr. So they were constantly on the lookout for Nazi U-boats. The problem was this particular convoy did not have as many Coast Guard cutters as it needed. And what that meant was a particular U-boat, if coming in from the right direction, could get around the Coast Guard cutters who were supposed to protect the transport ship. This is a picture of the SS Dorchester before it was turned into a transport ship. It had actually been a cruise ship. And then it got reshaped and painted gray and turned into a troop transport. The first place it went was up to Newfoundland in Canada, and it docked there in St. John's. And this is a sign that was prevalent there, where there was a great deal of worry about Nazi spies. In reality, it turns out there probably weren't nearly as many spies as people were worried about, if any. But there was this concern that there was this network of Nazi spies all over the globe, and especially in Newfoundland, and that if anybody even hinted at what the routes were of these ships trying to cross from Newfoundland to Greenland or to Europe, Nazi U-boat captains would learn about it and would be able to attack. The Dorchester and its convoy left New York, went up to Newfoundland, had to deal with this paranoia about spies. They were there for a short time, and then they traveled across the Atlantic. The weather was just unforgiving. It was brutally cold. There was a big storm the night that they were traveling across the Atlantic and getting close to Greenland. The ocean spray was turning to ice and just coating the ships. And so multiple times the convoy had to stop so they could de-ice the ships. This is a picture from the Coast Guard cutter Comanche, which is what Charles W. David Jr. was on. You can see how thick that ice was. They had to break it up and get it overboard. Otherwise, there was a possibility that it might sink them. And stopping the convoy was incredibly dangerous, because the moment they stopped, that left them much more vulnerable to attacks. It was much easier to find out where they were in the water by the Nazi U-boats. So having to stop and de-ice like this was a huge threat. The ice also just shows you how dangerous it was to be attacked and to end up in any situation where you would end up in the water. That's where most men would die within 15 minutes from hypothermia and from exposure to the cold, because the water was just so frigid. This man here is the Nazi U-boat captain, Karl-Jurg Wachter. I included him in the book throughout, in part for narrative purposes. I wanted to show what the enemy was doing. But one thing that he had done was he kept a pretty detailed log of everything he was doing, kind of a captain's journal. And I was able to track precisely where his U-boat was and what he was seeing, what he was thinking, and why he fired his torpedoes when he did, why he chose not to at certain times, and how he snuck in through this convoy to try to attack the troop transport. And so there's lots of important details that came from his journal that I was able to use to tell his story and the story of the U-boat. So I go back and forth in the story from the perspective of where the chaplains and Charles were to his perspective as the one hunting them. And he eventually died from an Allied attack on his U-boat in the Mediterranean a couple of years after the events of this night. So last thing I'll say, that's the story. Let me get into the kind of heroics of the story now. I'll go ahead and I'll just throw out here as I'll jump off sharing my screen. But if anyone is interested in getting a signed copy of the book, since we're not doing this in person, you can email me at contact@stephentcollis.com. If you order the book, email me your name and address, and I can personalize what's called a book plate for you, which is something I can sign, and you can stick it in the inside cover of the book and turn your copy into a signed copy. And I'm happy to do that if folks just want to reach out at contact@stephentcollis.com. So what happened that night? The ship gets the Dorchester gets attacked. It gets hit by the torpedoes fired by Wachter and his crew. And as the ship is going down, it sunk very, very quickly. The 4 chaplains were up on the upper decks and could have escaped very quickly on their own. And in fact, there was nothing preventing them from doing so. They could have done that. It wasn't their duty to go down with the ship or anything. What made the story incredibly powerful is only about 200 men on that troop transport survived that night. But many of them testified that the reason they survived was because of what the chaplains had done. The chaplains gave up their gloves, their boots, their life preservers, in some instances, their jackets to men. They provided a sense of calm along the deck. They got men off the ship and into the water. And some of the final scenes that people saw, that the survivors saw, were of these 4 men of different religions locked arm in arm and praying together, according to their own religious traditions. And that has led to them being called the Immortal Chaplains and the 4 Chaplains Foundations, whose theme or whose motto is unity without uniformity. And this idea that interfaith people can act in unity towards common goals without sacrificing their faith and their identity of who they are. The chaplains helped save people and get them into the water, but the water was so deadly and so cold, chances of anyone surviving were pretty slim. And that's where the Comanche and the Coast Guard cutters came in. Their job was to rescue people. When the SS Comanche started pulling up to places where they thought people might be alive, a number of the men on the Comanche figuratively froze because they were afraid of literally freezing. And so they weren't willing to jump into the water. And the captain of the ship had ordered men to go in and try and save some of the survivors from the Dorchester. A lot of the men wouldn't do it. And it was Charles W. David Jr., this black man who was not allowed to serve as anything other than a cook, who stepped forward and volunteered. And then a number of officers jumped in and volunteered as well. And those men together saved about half of the survivors by jumping into the water again and again and again and pulling people out into the Comanche. There's lots of really amazing details about that you'd have to read the book to see, but it was a really powerful story. And Charles also ended up saving a number of the officers who got stuck out there. 2 men who would have died if not for Charles's efforts. And the powerful part of Charles' story is he had a cold and he was feeling sick. He could have just said, "I'm a cook," and gone down below and stuck to his duties. But instead, with a cold, he volunteered to jump into the water again and again and again. And sadly, he passed away 2 weeks later from pneumonia because he got sick that night from doing that. So you've got these 5 men, different races and religions, who sacrificed themselves for all sorts of other men of different races and religions. And it's a powerful example, I think, of selflessness and trying to lose ourselves in serving others. And so it's a story that I think is was important then and continues to be important today when you look at the polarization of our country. All right, Mike, I went on for a really long time, but that's a summary of the story and the key players and the book itself and what I explore in it. So I'd love to answer any questions or just have a conversation about it.
Yeah. So you were describing the image of people seeing the four chaplains as the ship is going down, and I think that brings us to Mark Zaid's question in the Q&A. Another figure from the legal world. Thanks for being on, Mark. So he says, as has been mentioned, the story of the four chaplains is now well-known history. How quickly did it become a PR propaganda? I'm saying that in a positive way. Talking point for the War Department / U.S. to use against the Nazis, if at all. I certainly know of the 1948 stamp, but that was post-war. My grandfather, Rabbi David Max Eichhorn, also a contemporaneous Army chaplain. I tell a story in the GI's Rabbi, and I recommend that book to everyone looking for World War II chaplaincy information. Rabbi David Max Eichhorn was a personal friend of Rabbi Goode, and I remember as a child being told of the story, and my grandfather gave me a gift of stamps I mentioned above that I still cherish. Yeah. So how did the story get out there? It seems like also it could very easily have been lost. These four guys amongst 900 in maybe the most chaotic situation imaginable. How did the story get out there and become this kind of a well-known event?
It's a good question, and I think I can answer this and the second question about where did I get my information for the book, kind of in the same place. So, or at least partially the second one. There's lots of top secret documents that were top secret at the time about the sinking of the Dorchester. And all of those, there were all sorts of things transmitted, various transmissions coming back to DC. And as you can imagine, this was just seen as a horrible tragedy. In fact, it was the largest troop carrying tragedy of the entire war for the United States. Those top secret documents are now housed in the National Archives, and you can go to their facility, not their main building near the National Mall, but out a bit, and you can access all of those documents. They've been declassified and you can review them. It took a while. At first, this was just a devastating attack, but what started to come through as they started interviewing survivors was this repeated story of how the chaplains had saved people, and the story of the chaplains praying, and the story of the chaplains doing things to help people get off the ship, and continuing to encourage people who were already in the water, even as the ship was sinking. And as those little snippets of reports started to come in, there were men in DC putting this together who started notifying their superiors. So this is all occurring in the weeks after the sinking. Even then, it wasn't really used as kind of a propaganda piece in a positive sense, as Mark said, until after the war. And it was after the war that it really started to become something that could be used. The stamp was made, and it continues to be used this day to enforce and reinforce what the chaplaincy especially is supposed to be all about. Charles W. David Jr.'s story was known at the time, and he received the same honor that the chaplains did, and received all of the same award and attention, but his story kind of slipped away to history, in part, I think, because he was a Black man that didn't get the same attention. But I think a bigger part was the groups that kept the stories of the chaplains alive were various religious groups with which they were affiliated. And those groups continued to push that story and ask for recognition and push for recognition in a way that Charles didn't get until recently. So I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. One thing that was interesting to me in the book from the Jewish perspective was your description of when they're arriving at the chaplain school, and there's these two Jewish chaplains amongst the sea of non-Jews, and essentially the other chaplains don't know anything about Judaism. Can you describe that and how you get from there to this interfaith spirit?
Yeah, so there is what I find to be a humorous story where Rabbi Goode and the only other rabbi with him at the chaplain school, which at the time happened to be hosted at Harvard University. It really had nothing to do with Harvard. It just that's where they had it. Before that, it had been a place called Fort Benjamin Harris. They decided to room the two rabbis together. And at one point, they're in their dorm room and they hear a knock on the door. They open it up, and there's this long line of chaplains outside the door. And they're kind of like, what's going on? And the chaplains admit that they had been in a training and had been told, now look, when you're out there in the battlefield, you may need to do something to help your Jewish soldiers. So let's say something horrible happens, what are you going to do? And none of them had absolutely any clue what to do. And so they had come to Rabbi Goode and his fellow rabbi to get advice and learn and understand better. That was kind of the air and the vibe that they created at the chaplaincy school. And I want to emphasize that was not by accident. The chaplaincy after World War I decided that they needed to have chaplains who could serve everybody. So they created a pretty elaborate system to weed out those people who might want to be chaplains, but were not willing to be chaplains to everyone. And so they had a pretty elaborate system in place by the time World War II started, so that everybody who eventually ended up as a chaplain was somebody that they thought could embrace this notion of unity without uniformity, could stay very, very strong in their own faith and in their own tradition, but also serve people of other traditions. So it wasn't an accident that you had a whole bunch of men together who were willing to work well together. The people that couldn't do that had already been kind of weeded out and not allowed in the first place.
I think that connects to, we have a question from Rabbi Sheldon Lewis, who was a Vietnam era chaplain. Do we know anything about the relationship of the four chaplains before the tragedy? They started to get to know each other, or some of them at chaplain school?
They did. Some of them knew each other at the chaplaincy school and the training. That's where two of them met. The others they met along the way when they were waiting for their assignments. So not everybody was together at the chaplaincy school at Harvard. Some had been assigned other places and just waiting. But once they got to the point where they were just waiting for an assignment to get sent out into the field, they were together at a place and started to really get to know each other. Two of them got to know each other very well at chaplaincy school, but they really didn't become friends and really start working closely together until they met in New York City, getting ready to get onto the Dorchester. But it was very, very, very quickly they realized that they all shared a common vision and wanted to work together well, and that's actually reflected in some of their letters and things that they wrote home before they passed away.
One of the things that struck me is we always talk about the religious diversity, but looking at the convoy, there's this interesting military that there's Army, Navy, Merchant Marines, Coast Guard, all working together. Can you tell a little bit about the different roles that they had in this convoy?
Yeah, so you've got it's an Army troop transport that's being run by Navy folks, and then you've got Coast Guard folks who are there to protect them. You've got Navy personnel on board who are there to run the guns and everything else to help all the folks who are in the Army. So it's an interesting mix of folks with a lot of different questions about who's supposed to report to whom and who is in command of both the convoy, the individual ships. But they had it all coordinated. There was a convoy leader, there was the captain of the ship who was Navy, then there was the Army leaders over all of the Army personnel, and then of course the Coast Guard folks were operating on each of their ships independently, but also reporting to the leader of the whole convoy. All of that had to work together in a way that would result in positive outcomes. Now, of course, one of the problems here is we didn't get a positive outcome, and the Nazis had really sad and remarkable success against our convoys for a long while in the war before we kind of figured out how we could stop that from happening. And so I think one of the tragedies of the Dorchester is that all of that coordination had not quite been perfected yet. And so you had problems like not enough Coast Guard cutters protecting the rear of the convoy, which allowed Wachter and his U-boat to sneak up behind.
Getting back to your sources, you just mentioned Wachter. How do we have an anonymous question. If Wachter died during the war, how do we have his logs? Where do you find those? And were they, I assume they're in German, were you're proficient enough to translate?
So I found them, they've actually been, had already been translated into English for us, but they were, each time the U-boat captains went out on a particular mission, they would keep these logs, very detailed logs. Wachter was especially good at that. And so when he finally died, that was on 3 or 4 missions later. So he had already turned in the logs from this mission, and they were there and housed, and archivists since that have been able to access them and translate them for us.
I'm seeing a couple questions about what was recovered from the Dorchester. One, were any of the bodies of the four chaplains discovered? And then another question, uh, do you know if the Dorchester and/or any artifacts or personnel were ever recovered from the wreckage after the fact?
Yeah, so none of the bodies really, I shouldn't say none, but very few. Charles David Jr. actually got buried in Greenland because he didn't die that night, right? Charles David Jr. died a couple weeks later. So he got back onto the Comanche and collapsed from fatigue and then was taken to a field hospital in Greenland where he passed away, and he was buried there. And 50, almost 60 years later, an investigator for the Coast Guard found him, notified the family, and they moved him and had him buried in New York City, where his family was from. So the rest of the folks who died that night were lost to the sea, and so it was kind of a burial at sea. Some of the bodies there, after they passed away, their life preservers eventually became too waterlogged and they started to sink. Others were clinging to rafts or broken pieces of lifeboats. And what the Navy did was, after a small ceremony, shot those into the water and then gave them burials at sea. So most of the people who died that night, including the chaplains, were lost to the sea, and that part of the Atlantic has become their eternal grave. As for other things, there are some things that were preserved that night. Some of the life preservers, a really emotional and tragic scene from that night is the life preservers. When the men went into the water, they had these red lights on them. So if you look at paintings trying to depict that night, or you can imagine the scene when the Coast Guard cutter Comanche comes sailing up and they look out, what they saw was a field of red lights bobbing in the water of men with these life preservers on. And their challenge was to figure out which of those men were alive that they could try to save. Some of those life preservers have been preserved, and other things like that are available in various museums. There's a Chaplaincy museum where you can see some of that. The Chapel of the Four Chaplains in Philadelphia has some of those, but there's not a lot. Most of it was lost as the Dorchester sunk.
Michael Werner asked a question about the Jewish personnel on the Dorchester. So we know Rabbi Goode was conducting religious services on the Dorchester. Any idea about numbers? How many?
I don't remember off the top of my head how many there were of each religion, but there were a contingent of Jewish personnel on the Dorchester. And in fact, one of the stories in the book was Rabbi Goode was going to celebrate a particular Jewish ceremony, and there was a chef in there who wanted to play craps, I think, and wouldn't get out and wouldn't let him do it. And the other chaplains came and basically defended Rabbi Goode and worked with them to get that guy out of there so they could do what they needed to do. So there were certainly other Jewish personnel on board, but I don't remember the total numbers off the top of my head.
We talk about the spirit of sacrifice and kind of the inspirational nature of the four chaplains story. That didn't apply to everyone on the Dorchester. So could you describe the difference in some of the actions as the ship is going down between the various personnel, the sacrifice of the four chaplains, those who kind of went in other directions?
Yeah, it's funny when you tell this story. I think there's a lot of people who say, well, of course, that's what they did. That's what people would do. That's great. And the reality is not everybody reacts the way the chaplains did or Charles W. David Jr. did. As I mentioned on the Comanche, a lot of the men just refused to get into the water because they were afraid of dying. On the Dorchester, you had a lot of people looking out for themselves, including one man who went crazy and came out with a big meat cleaver and started attacking people in a desperation to get off the ship. So you certainly had people whose goal and whose kind of panic-driven desire was just to save themselves. I do think there was something powerful and heroic about these men choosing and knowing that they were going to sacrifice themselves to save others. It seems very early on in the process they knew that that's exactly what they had gotten themselves into.
A question about the chaplain's family. Did any of the chaplains have family? Do they have descendants alive today? You do write a lot about their families in the book.
I do, and many of them do have families still alive today. We had the 80th anniversary celebration dinner in Philadelphia of this, celebrating this event in February, and many of the grandchildren and even children of some of the chaplains were there. I mean, the tragic part of this story is all of them, except for Father John Washington, were married. And so they left behind widows and children. Charles David Jr., he had a son who was just 3 years old and a wife. I have a picture of when Charles was given the award for what he had done that night. I have a picture of his son there receiving it. His son eventually became a U.S. Marshal. And the way I learned about his family was I was able to find his granddaughter and his nephew, and they were willing to chat with me and share me a lot of the family history and stories and other things that helped me kind of piece together his part in the book. So yeah, the families are out there. It was such a tragic story that these men, sacrificed themselves to save all these others. And at the same time, we're sacrificing the opportunity to be with their families, which is, incredibly heartbreaking and was very hard and has had multi-generational effects as the children and grandchildren have had to grapple with the idea that they no longer have their loved ones. On that note, real quick, Mike, so I don't forget, let me share this story about Rabbi Goode and his family. So I tell a story in the book about how, everything was all fine and dandy at chaplaincy school because they had put all these men together who were going to embrace the idea of unity without uniformity and interfaith in action. But then they had to leave and they had to come back into the rest of American society. And Rabbi Goode and his wife, Teresa, got stationed in Goldsboro, North Carolina. They went down there and he had to find housing. There wasn't military housing. He had to find a place to live for his family, just somewhere in the community. And everywhere he went, people wouldn't rent to him. And there was a moment when he knocked on a door and a woman seemed very pleasant, was gonna rent, allow them to stay in a home in her house. And then they saw his star on his uniform signifying that he was a Jew. And then she said, I don't know, I don't think I can rent to you. And eventually he persuaded her and she gave them the room to rent. This is the email I got from a reader. She said this, she said, I especially like the story you shared about Alexander Goode when he first moved to Goldsboro. Hearing that he went door to door looking for a place for him and Teresa to live, and how when he finally found a possible place, the woman almost didn't let Alex and Teresa live there because they were Jewish. Here is my personal connection. Not long after the Goode's experience, a young Latter-day Saint Army Air Corps lieutenant named Floyd Goetz and his wife Mary from Utah were transferred to Goldsboro and needed a place to live. They also went door to door, trying to find someone who would let them rent a room, but nobody would. The Goodes generously welcomed them into their home to live. They became fast friends. The Goodes introduced Mary to seafood, coming from Utah she had never had before. Not long after that, Alex was sent to serve on the Dorchester. This young couple from Utah, a number of years later, adopted 3 children and raised them. I am the youngest of those 3 kids. My parents, throughout my upbringing, frequently shared stories of their friendship with Alex, Teresa, and Rosalie Goode. In fact, for more than 50 years, my mother exchanged letters around Christmas time or Hanukkah with Teresa and Rosalie, until Rosalie was the Goode's daughter, until Rosalie died tragically. When my mother didn't receive Rosalie's letter, she was worried, and she was eventually able to speak to Teresa on the phone just days before Teresa Goode passed away. I thought you might enjoy hearing one more story about Alex and Teresa Goode and how their legacy of goodness continues to be passed down from generation to generation. I thought that was a really powerful story and super great to share with your audience here who have an interest in Rabbi Goode's place in this story.
Yeah, great to hear. Here's an intriguing one from Robert Rubin. As a child around 1963, I remember seeing the 4 chaplains as an exhibit in a wax museum in D.C. I can still picture it now. Is it still there? You happen to know anything about that?
I am not aware of a wax museum or having the 4 chaplains in a wax museum. I do know that if you're interested in this, you can go to the Chapel of the 4 Chaplains in Philadelphia. Father John's Catholic Church in Kearney, New Jersey still has a monument to the chaplains, including like a statue. And then if you go into like the Army, if you go to the Army Chief of Chaplains in Washington, D.C. at the Pentagon, not that anybody can just walk in there, but they've got the chaplains on the wall there. So there are monuments to them in a lot of different places and more than what I just mentioned, but I'm not aware of anything like that with a wax museum or model like that was described.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. It must have been up there at some point. Robert Olish asked, do you know whether any of the chaplains intermarried with spouses of a different religion?
I do not. They did not, as far as I know. Obviously, Father John did not, but no, they did not. Now, I don't know after. I don't know after the chaplains passed or after the chaplains passed away if their spouses might have married with someone of a different faith. But at the time, they were all married within the same faith. There's another question here by Mark Bayer that says, were they of the same age and had any of them had experience in war before? I wanted to touch on that. Most of them were of the same age, except for George Fox. George Fox was older, and he had actually served in World War I and had broken his back in World War I. He had been in inside an old building that near the very end of the war got attacked and collapsed on top of him, and it broke his back. And he was suffering from what we now know as PTSD. Of course, he didn't know that's what it was at the time. And he had this broken back, which really limited what he could do physically. And yet the day of Pearl Harbor, the first thing he said was he was going to sign up because those boys are going to need me. Gives you a sense, I think, a little bit of the selflessness of these men. He knew what he was getting into and yet was willing to serve almost immediately.
We're getting a few people in the Q&A responding on the Wax Museum. Daryl Densford points out there was a National Historical Wax Museum on 26th Street, and that had the four chaplains display. Michael Werner saying the same thing, National Historical Wax Museum, Washington, D.C. So that
Great.
answers the question of the wax sculpture. An anonymous question, how do you discover Charles David Jr. if his story hadn't been properly deserved? So his story was out there, but you just did.
It's a good question. So like I say, he got the same medal as the chaplains immediately. Then the chaplains kind of took on this mystique. They got honored in Congress. There's the Four Chaplains Day officially recognized by Congress. There was the Chapel of the Four Chaplains and nonprofits built up around them. And a lot of that was being pushed by their religious communities. Now, part of that is because they all died on the same night. Charles died 2 weeks later. I was reading another book that had been written about this story when I was doing my research. And at one point there was one paragraph that mentioned Charles helping rescue people and that he died a few weeks later. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, he died and he sacrificed himself just like the chaplains did. It sure seems to me that he needs to get the exact same treatment each of the chaplains were getting. And so in my book, the book contract I had with my publisher, the book was going to be called The Immortal Chaplains. And I had a due date about not long after I discovered Charles, this one paragraph about Charles. And so I called up my editor and I said, look, you got to give me a new due date. By the way, publishers are trying to make money. That's the last thing on earth they ever want to hear, right? This wasn't like an academic press to kind of be relaxed about it. Their hope is to sell books and they've got a production schedule that's got to keep moving along. But I called up my editor and I said, look, I discovered this man. I need more time. I need to find his family. I need to do research. I need to figure out a way to incorporate him into the entire manuscript. We also need to change the title of the book. We're calling it The Immortal Chaplains. He's not a chaplain, so we need to call it The Immortals. And we need to switch everything up. And thankfully, my editor agreed immediately, didn't even hesitate, and said, yeah, do what you got to do. We'll give you, we can extend it out. And then I immediately just started trying to hunt down his family. What I learned generally is a lot of his story had not been told at all, but to the extent there were parts of it that had been told, they had been told in snippets. Some by his own family, some by other folks. No one had been able to bring them all together before, and so I was grateful I could work with them and make it happen. His nephew is a dance professor, I think at the University of Arizona now, who actually put together kind of a dance musical telling more about the story of Charles David Jr. as well. So there, hopefully more and more his stories getting out there.
I'm curious about your main job is as a law professor. Does that work connect to this story? It doesn't seem to be much of a legal element to it.
So my specialty is in the First Amendment and law and religion, where law and religion intersect. What turned me onto this story is I was writing a separate book, just helping people understand the American regime of religious liberty, which is grossly misunderstood in our country, and nobody gets it. Everybody has strong opinions about it, but nobody really understands it. And one of the things in my book that I was thinking about was this idea of the Puritan mistake, and I came across the story of the Chaplains. So I also have an MFA in creative writing, and I enjoy writing novels. The story of the four chaplains, for me, kind of reflects what we can achieve in the United States when we don't commit the Puritan mistake, and when we actually respect religious freedom for all. Again, we can have unity without uniformity. The big question that we religious freedom scholars try to grapple with is this question of how can people of very different religious beliefs, including atheists and agnostics, I mean, across the entire religious spectrum, how can people coexist alongside one another, and not just coexist, but thrive despite those very different religious beliefs? That's the whole project of what we're trying to figure out, because we have the most religiously diverse country in the history of humanity. And we have to make sure our regime of religious freedom continues to allow it to work. So I saw this story as a wonderful real world example of that, and one that was inspiring, and I just wanted to tell it. So I pitched it to my publisher and they ran with it. So there is an intersection to my scholarship and what I do as a law professor, but I also just enjoy writing good stories and books. And so it's kind of a combination of those two things.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the concept of the Puritan mistake, that's the idea that they want religious liberty for themselves, but don't apply it to others. Is that my understanding?
Yeah. The idea of the Puritan mistake. Yeah, you summed it up just right. We want freedom for ourselves, but not for anybody else. And I asked the scholar who coined that term. He and I were walking along one day, and I asked him, I said, "Why'd you pick on the poor Puritans? As far as I can tell, there's not a human group in history that hasn't committed the Puritan mistake at some point or another." And he said, "No question. There's no question that's true, but I had to pick somebody. And I knew I wanted some that I felt like my audience would know the story and would resonate with. And so I used the Puritans, but it really is the human mistake." Sounds like something George Costanza and Seinfeld would come up with. So it doesn't, not very bright.
A couple more in the Q&A. Michael Warner asks, what unit or division were the Army troops assigned to?
I do not remember off the top of my head. It's in the book. You'd have to grab it and read it, but I apologize. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Sam Hillard asks, I would like to know, to be a chaplain, did you have to be a rabbi or priest? Can you speak to the qualifications required to become a chaplain?
I assume this question means not now, but at the time. You had to be some form of clergy with certain training, and then you had to be endorsed by a particular endorsing agency. And that was the method they used for weeding out those men that they felt like wouldn't be able to play well with others. The military went to the various groups, the religious groups across the country, the leaders of those groups. They said, "We want you to put up people that can meet these criteria." And one of the most important criterion we have is that they've got to be somebody who can be very strong in their own faith, but also serve people of other faiths. So they use those endorsing agencies to weed folks out. At the time, the chaplaincy was not nearly as diverse as it is today. They pigeonholed everybody into three categories: Jewish, Protestant, and Catholic. And if you didn't perfectly fit into one of those, then you just got thrown in with Protestants. So you had like Latter-day Saints and Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists, none of whom are really Protestant, but they just shoehorned them into Protestantism and called them Protestant. And then you had Jewish groups and others helping endorsing folks to get the right people there. But you did have to be some form of trained clergy. You couldn't just be someone off the street walking in. Otherwise, you'd never get past the endorsing agencies that needed to endorse you to help you become a chaplain.
Yeah, and the endorsing agency for the Jewish chaplains is the Jewish Welfare Board, which is created at the beginning of World War I, when there's over 200,000 Jews in service, and that's the first time they need something like that. The first Jewish chaplains are in the Civil War, kind of becomes institutionalized in World War I, and then we get to World War II, and JWB is well established as the morale and endorsing organization for Jews in the military.
And I'll just add, that's a similar process that still happens today. People who want to become chaplains, it's more formal, they have to have more formal education, but then there has to be an endorsing agency who signs off on them before they can even be considered to become a chaplain.
A couple questions I'm seeing about getting the book, and I will say we will send a follow-up email to everyone who registered for this with links to buy the book, the email address to get the signed plate if you're interested in that, and other information about the book and where to get it. An anonymous attendee on Wachter. Did Wachter have family? Curious if you ever reached out to them.
Wachter, as far as I know, did not have family. He was a pretty young guy, like early 20s. I mean, he had parents, of course, but I don't know. He didn't have a spouse or surviving children or anything like that I'm aware of. I did not reach out to see if maybe he had cousins or if I could go back and hunt down his ancestry as much. I hunted it down some. I learned where he was from, how he got into the military, but I wanted to use Wachter really as telling the story of the enemy here, and not a deep dive into his life. I did deep dives into the lives of the 4 chaplains and Charles David Jr., and then just enough of a dive into Wachter to be able to offer his viewpoint throughout. And quite frankly, that was not the law professor in me, but that was the creative writer in me. You want in a story like this to keep tension high, to keep readers moving, and think about movies you've seen. That's often or books you've read. That's often what happens, right? You see what the enemy is doing, so you know the threat is real and it's coming. And Wachter's journal and his story allowed me to be able to do that. But I never intended to really do a deep dive into Wachter, which I think, might be worth doing. I should tell you one thing that is interesting. Probably about 20 years ago or something, when the last of the survivors were getting to the age where more and more people were passing away from old age, a number of the folks on the U-boat were still alive as well. And there was a reunion in Washington, D.C. of the survivor of the Dorchesters and the German soldiers on the U-boat. They all came together, and various scholars are actually able to interview the German U-boat soldiers as well. I don't think sailors is the right term, although it might be. And so I was able to get some perspective of what was happening on the U-boat from those interviews with these German men. So some of those men did survive the war and did come back and met with the Dorchester folks. And there was actually a pretty powerful moment of forgiveness and reconciliation there among those groups.
That leads pretty well to Mark Zaid's question. Was one about if there's any wreckage of the Dorchester itself that was found. And are there still survivors around now, I guess, of the Dorchester or of the U-boat?
I think the very last survivor from the Dorchester passed away, I want to say in 2019. Thankfully, there had been a whole bunch of interviews with them that I was able to, they had been done on the real old video cassette tapes, even pre-VHS. I was able to take all those and digitize them, and we have them. But I'm not aware of any of those folks still being alive.
Yeah, we're at the point where it's awfully tough with the World War II vets of any kind, yet alone survivors of a specific incident from 43.
Yeah.
An anonymous question. Curious if you feel that there are other unsung heroes of the story you didn't have time to recognize, like you mentioned, other Coast Guard officers who followed David into the water.
Yes. And Charles's experience on the Comanche was not all bad. It wasn't as if it was just blatant racism all the time. It was mostly folks from the South, Coast Guardsmen from the South, who were blatantly racist to him, but many of the other folks he had great relationships with. And in fact, one of them, a man named Dick Swanson, was in charge of the sonar room, which was right across from where Charles did much of his work. Charles played the harmonica. Dick had somehow managed to smuggle his saxophone on board the Comanche, which apparently wasn't supposed to have, it's too big. But they would get together and play. They both liked the blues. And so Dick would play his sax, Charles would play his harmonica, and they called it the Comanche Blues. And a whole bunch of other men would come around and get all around them and just listen to them playing together. Dick was one of the people who went into the water that night to try to save folks again and again and again alongside Charles. And at one point in the rescue effort, Dick couldn't get up. They had found the day before a huge cargo net, and they had thrown that over the edge of the Coast Guard cutter, and then they were climbing down that into the water and lifting people up to save them. And at one point, after they've been doing this for hours, Dick Swanson got stuck about halfway up that net, and he yelled out. He said, "Charles, I can't keep going." Like, he didn't have the muscle anymore to pull himself up, and he was about to lose his grip. Charles screams down, "Come on, Swanee, you can do it." He called him Swanee. And Dick Swanson just couldn't move. So Charles went down, grabbed Dick, and carried him back up and saved his life at that point. There was another man, Robert Anderson, who agreed immediately to jump into the water. He went out on one of these life rafts and was feeding people to Charles and Dick Swanson to get them up safely onto the cutter. And he was out there by himself in the dark on the life raft, checking to see if any of the other men on this lifeboat were still alive. And at that point, as he was out there by himself, just checking to see if there was anyone else still alive he could rescue, the captain of the Comanche ordered the ship to move on. And Charles, so he's going to leave him behind. And, you may think in your mind, well, you just turn around, come right back. But no, it would take about 30 minutes for the ship to turn around and come back. And if the ship left even just a little bit, they were never going to find Robert Anderson again. So he went out there to find people, and he was just going to be left for dead. Charles sprinted to the front of the ship and screamed at the captain. So you can imagine this cook bursting in on the captain and telling him, "We still have a man out there. We still have a man out there." But Charles did that. The captain immediately recognized what was going on and was able, it took about a half hour, but he was able to get the ship back around so they could grab Robert Anderson. So there are stories like that. I don't go deep into their lives, but I do honor them and share their stories from the whole experience.
Hey, we're just about out of time. I think we can get a couple more quick questions in here. One from Daryl Densford. Did you discover if Charles David had any faith or religious affiliation?
He did. And his family actually immigrated from the Caribbean and ended up in the New York City area. And his father actually helped build all the pews for, I want to say, a Lutheran church in the Queens area. I may be wrong about that. It might be Brooklyn, but he helped build all the pews in a Lutheran church. And so Charles did have some faith. Now, it didn't come out as a driving force in his life the way it seemed, the way it obviously did with the Chaplains. In other words, I didn't find all sorts of records or indicators that everything he was doing was driven by his faith, but his family certainly had this connection to this church where his dad had helped build all the pews. And he and his wife lived in Harlem together before he joined the Coast Guard.
But what I'm seeing sent to me, people asking, when's the movie coming out? Has this ever been depicted in film, or is any talk of that?
No, it never has. I was disappointed when there was some Tom Hanks movie that came out during the pandemic about ships crossing the Atlantic and being attacked by Nazi U-boats. I thought that movie was a gross disappointment because it didn't have any of the power of this story. My dream one day is someone like Tom Hanks will learn about this story and want to see it on the big screen. But as of right now, it has not happened.
Yeah, it certainly seems it would suit the medium well to be a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we're just about out of time. I did want to address a couple things people are asking about the recording of this. We are recording it, and we'll have it posted on YouTube. So in the follow-up email, we will include a link to the recording as well as information to buy the book. Stephen, you got any final words?
No, I just very, very grateful to be here and thankful for all the very active questions. I wish we could have gotten to all of them, but please tell folks, do not hesitate to reach out. And I'm happy to send book plates to those who have a copy of the book and would like a signed copy.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being on. Remind people one more time, we're doing this next week with Ira Kidmacher with the book Monsters and Miracles. Thanks so much, Stephen, and we will send out information about the book to everyone who registered.